Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us here today. I am very, very pleased to be joined this afternoon by, of course, to my far left, Dr. Dobbs, who has been right by my side throughout the last year dealing with COVID. We also have Dr. Meredith Travelstead immediately to my left, and of course, Dr. Clay Hayes, which many of you have met over the last year as he's played multiple roles in helping us deal with the coronavirus. We continue to make significant progress in our fight against COVID-19. Today, we are here to talk about something very, very important. In our view, one of the main tools in our toolbox left to deal with COVID-19, and that is potential more vaccinations. Mississippi has administered over 1.34 million vaccines, and over 500,000 of our fellow Mississippians are fully vaccinated. Nearly 900,000 Mississippians have received their first shot, and we continue to add more and more each day. On average, between 25 and 30,000 additional shots each day. In addition to seeing these significant numbers of shots going in arms, our COVID cases, as well as our hospitalizations, continue to plummet. Right now, our 7-day rolling average of new cases is just barely above 200, which is over 90% down from our peak of around 2,400 cases in early January. In addition, hospitalizations are down 88% from our January peak. We are now down to 163 Mississippians currently hospitalized with COVID, and that's down from a high of 1,444. ICU utilization and the number of patients on ventilators are down 85% from their January peaks. ICU utilization has gone from approximately 360 patients down to approximately 52. And the number of patients on ventilators in our state is now down to 35 patients, down from a peak of 230. As we continue to see the light at the end of the tunnel, you all have heard me say that when the vaccines first became available, that while the light was too far away, that we did see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. That light is getting brighter and brighter, and the tunnel is getting shorter and shorter. However, as we move forward, I cannot express how important it is that these rollout of the vaccines continue to ensure that we can return to more and more of a sense of normalcy. With summer quickly approaching, it is important that we remain vigilant against the virus and continue to take necessary precautions when necessary. In recent days, we have heard calls from some in Washington to re-implement burdensome mandates and to shut down our economies in the wake of rising cases in other states. But we're not going to do that in Mississippi. The reason we're not going to do it in Mississippi is because the data does not justify it. I'm very proud of the progress Mississippi has made. I'm very proud of all of the people who have worked so hard over the last year. Obviously, these three docs sitting beside me at the table represent literally thousands and thousands and thousands of healthcare heroes who have done tremendous work throughout. I couldn't be more proud of the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, the Mississippi Department of Health, the Mississippi National Guard, and so many others across the state at how much they have worked and how well they have represented our state through the vaccination process. I'm optimistic that we are near the end of this road, but I also know that for us to continue towards the right path, we need more and more of our fellow Mississippians willing to get the vaccine. As I mentioned earlier, 900,000 Mississippians, nearly 900,000 have gotten at least their first shot. We've got literally tens of thousands of additional appointments scheduled. But as I travel and listen to people around our state, I understand that there is still some vaccine hesitancy. There are still some people. Now, it started in early January. It was primary amongst those in our state that are in more rural areas, primarily amongst our African American population. And we've worked hard every day to educate people across the state. Today's event is really just another opportunity for education purposes. I wanted to hear from some of our state's leading physicians on some of the questions that you all may have. You may have said, I just haven't quite been ready yet to go get that shot. I've heard that from folks. Now, with that, I want to begin today's remarks with, if we could, with Dr. Clay Hayes. Dr. Hayes, if you would just remind everyone the practice of medicine that you have and a former state medical, I don't know what y'all call it, president, CEO?
Yeah, president.
Former
yeah.
state medical president.
Right,
and
thank you.
Been very involved, so if you would.
Sure. So I'm a cardiologist here in Jackson and enjoy practicing medicine. I was seeing patients this morning and this afternoon and see a lot of patients with those sort of questions. As cardiologists, patients are always concerned about having a heart attack. And there has definitely been an uptick in heart attacks around this COVID environment. And a lot of that has to do with people afraid of going initially was afraid to go to the hospital because they thought they were going to get COVID. And so they were staying at home having heart attacks because they weren't going to get medical care. And this is sort of the same idea, is they need to go get the care that they need, particularly the vaccines. Now, people question, well, do they have blood clots or something like that? Well, there has been a little higher rate of blood clots in patients that have COVID. And so the idea is if they get the vaccine, their chance of getting blood clots theoretically goes down. And so we are encouraging patients to get the vaccines. I know I've had my vaccine. As I was telling Dr. Dobbs earlier today, 86% of the healthcare workers at St. Dominic's have been vaccinated with at least one shot. And so as a medical community, we believe in the vaccine, and we're going to continue to encourage people to get it.
Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for being here. I really do appreciate it. Dr. Meredith Travelstead, will you give us a little bit of your background, please?
Yes, I'm an OBGYN at the Women's Clinic here in Jackson, and I've been in practice for 20 years now.
Well, great. I know we're going to have some great questions. Dr. Dobbs, I don't think you need to introduce yourself to the people at this event, but if you would just give us a little bit of a background and kind of where you think we are.
Yeah, well, since we're talking about the clinical part, I'm an infectious disease specialist and did treated infectious disease issues and had patients up until 2 years ago when I took this job, and I do miss it somewhat, seeing patients directly.
Now I'm your only patient, right?
No, but we're making great progress. Our numbers are down. We're able to do more. It's fantastic to be able to be active outdoors. I have a lot more time on the weekends, and I'm much appreciative of that. But it's also an opportunity. We do have some, it's not that we're out of the woods, we have the light at the end of the tunnel, but we also have a train behind us. And we may want to go ahead and get as many folks vaccinated right now while our cases are low. And we also have variants around the corner, right, that may give us some challenges. But we're very pleased, especially with the Pfizer vaccine data that just came out, that it has a lot of retained potency even against the South African variant. So, we're doing great. But we have challenges ahead, and we have a great solution with vaccines available.
Right. Well, Dr. Dobbs, let's start with that. Let's start with the process of getting these vaccines. As I appreciate it, we now have 3 vaccines available from 3 different companies. Chase, through social media, had asked me talk a little bit about the approval process and really FDA approval versus the EUA and the emergency use authorization and sort of kind of how that works.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic question, and I think it's really important to kind of speak to what is the process for getting these vaccines approved. I think it's important to talk about the innovation that happened under Warp Speed, where they did one thing that was really brilliant, and they they basically did production and clinical trials at the same time. And if the clinical trials, the studies on people, didn't look like they wanted, they would just throw the vaccine away, right? Normally, you'll do your trials, and then you'll have a bunch of investors figure out if it's worth investing in and all this other stuff, and you build factories, and then you have all this time for production. Well, it was wise, and the government just purchased it and said, let's do the research and the production at the same time so we're not wasting any time, which was very, very smart. The other thing is after the studies came back, they went through this EUA process, or Emergency Use Authorization. But I want to emphasize that what they did is they cut bureaucratic red tape. They didn't cut corners. And making sure that it was so important that they put all the resources into looking at it very closely and very critically. The number of people who were in the studies was at least as many or more than many other vaccines that have been approved. So the process was expedited, but it was thorough, but it was efficient, but it wasn't anything that cut any corners.
We were talking earlier about the technology that was used in the 3 vaccines, and that's a question that I sometimes get. Is this a new technology? And Dr. Hayes and I were talking about the mRNA technology, and that really in his field, there's a number of different medicines that are allowed that use similar technology. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So we talk about mRNA technology and trying to sort of fool the body into developing an immune response. Well, the same thing we do a lot of research at Jackson Heart, and so cholesterol medicines, some of the newer cholesterol medications, we use the same sort of research platform to develop new cholesterol medications. And so, we're familiar with this, and so we're not afraid of the way vaccines are being produced. That's just part of the research process. So we feel very good, and we feel like the vaccines are very safe. Haven't seen, oftentimes we'll have an estimation of how many people will have a problem. Well, the actual reality that we're seeing in registries is a lot lower than what's being forecast to be a problem. And so that's just part of the research process, which is good.
Right, and my impression is, I talked to someone in the pharmaceutical space not too long ago, and when you look at most of these clinical trials, certainly with all 3 of the vaccines, they're literally utilized 30, 40, 50,000 individuals. And as I appreciate it, there are a lot of drugs on the market today whose clinical trials were much, much smaller in terms of the total number of individuals that were out there. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Well, great. One of the questions that I got from Melody, which I thought was really interesting, and I want to, before I ask this question, I want to make sure everyone understands. There's all this, all these numbers that are thrown out there where they're only 10% of the people are vaccinated, only 20%. So here are the real numbers in Mississippi. We have 2,976,000 Mississippians, and that's on the 2010 census. It's probably about there, maybe slightly below, but let's just say 2.976 million. Of those, I would submit to you that somewhere between 550 and 600,000 are under the age of 18. Now, there is a couple of these vaccines have the ability for those over the age of 16, but just for our purposes, I just want everyone to understand that we have about 2.2 to 2.3 million Mississippians that definitely fit in the category of being eligible for a vaccine. That means they are, in my mind, over the age of 16. They don't have not had significant reactions to vaccines in the past, et cetera. So when I think about how many can we actually get vaccinated in Mississippi, if we got 100% of those who are eligible right now, it'd be between 2.2 and 2.3 million. We've done 1.34 million shots. We've done just under 900,000 of that 2.2 million that have gotten at least one shot. So you're really looking at between 35 and 40%. And we've got a little over 500,000, or about 550,000, that are fully vaccinated now. So we're really at, right now, about 25% of Mississippians are fully vaccinated. And somewhere in the neighborhood of about 35 to 40% have received at least their first shot. So when we talk about our goals, I want to just be clear that we're looking at having this conversation today so that we can really figure out what we can do to continue to encourage those to get the vaccine. We hadn't had this conversation before, in large part because we found ourselves in a position in which literally for December and January and February and all of March, we had significantly more demand for the vaccine than we had supply. Well, two things have happened. One, we've gotten 1.34 million shots in arms, so there's a segment of the population that is behind us. The other thing that's been happening at the same time is that we've seen supply increase, as you would expect, on a weekly basis. As Dr. Dobbs said earlier, the federal government, under the previous administration, under Operation Warp Speed, they went ahead and they started doing manufacturing of vaccine before they knew if it was going to be safe or not. That meant that some of them got thrown out because some of them have not been approved yet. But it also means that we were able to get started months and months and months quicker than we otherwise would have. But we always knew that once the EUA occurred, that the delivery of those vaccines would increase more and more on a weekly basis. Well, that's where we find ourselves today. And now, as we get into April, and certainly as we get in towards the latter part of April and the early part of May, what we find ourselves with is a scenario in which maybe we're going to flip that corner where demand no longer significantly exceeds supply, but supply maybe exceeds demand. And so we want to make sure that everyone has adequate information to make a wise choice for themselves to get the vaccine if they think it makes sense. Meredith, one of the things that has certainly been discussed, and Dr. Dobbs, you may want to jump in here as well, is there's been a certainly vaccine hesitancy amongst younger females, and particularly as it surrounds reproduction, because throughout this process there's been lots and lots of rumors on lots of topics, but this is one that actually really caught hold, I think, certainly on social media, et cetera. And so I just would really like for you to at least talk through some of that and give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Governor. I'll give you an honorary doctor.
I got a promotion today. This is great. I'm going to have you here more often.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you for your support of our medical community. So this conversation is every day in clinic for me, is who should get the vaccine, can I get the vaccine, is it safe to get the vaccine in pregnancy and breastfeeding, and also in planning a future pregnancy. And a lot of that surrounds how the vaccine first was rolled out and how the studies were first done. In the patient population, they did not allow pregnant women and breastfeeding women in the study. However, there were, in the initial studies for the vaccine, there were some who spontaneously became pregnant that they have followed through the process, and they did not find any untoward bad outcomes or problems with their pregnancies. And then after that, they have since that time, the American College of OBGYNs and the American Society of Reproductive Medicine have promoted vaccinating pregnant women and breastfeeding women, knowing that this is the type viral vaccine that can be given to pregnant women. We know there are some vaccines that you don't receive during pregnancy and some that are attenuated or not live viral vaccines that are safe to give in pregnancy, like the flu vaccine and the pertussis Tdap vaccine we give during pregnancies, that to give our moms and our babies some passive immunity because of those vaccines. And so we know this is the type viral vaccine, a non-replicating viral vaccine that can be given during pregnancy. However, there's still a lot of concern because we have patients all the time that say, well, they didn't study it in pregnant women, they didn't study it in breastfeeding women, so there was a lot of concern about how the vaccine was made, how it was rolled out, how rapidly it was studied. But as time has gone on, we have more and more of a population of healthcare workers and frontline workers and patients that have gotten the vaccine during pregnancies who have been studied and who have agreed to sign up for the CDC's V-Safe, Vaccine Safe app, where they tell their symptoms, they tell their outcomes in their pregnancies, and they have a database of about 30,000 pregnancies. And so far, compared to just the background risk in the population. They haven't seen increased stillbirths, increased miscarriages, other complications, anomalies in the pregnancies. They have not seen any increase compared to the population. So we can feel better about pregnant ladies getting it. It's still a personal decision, and we encourage patients to have the conversation with your physician, talk about it, ask questions going into the breast milk. And they know that this is the type viral vaccine that cannot cross the placenta. You know, the big part of the research was being able to get this little code. The code is the mRNA, protected long enough to get it into our cells before it degrades. And that's the big thing I tell patients when they realize how rapidly it degrades. You know, there's a lot of internet information about it's going to change your DNA, or it's going to make you into some different form, or it will pass on to your baby, but it's not going to cross that placenta. It's not going to code for a different DNA. This is the step beyond DNA. It doesn't go into the nucleus. Remember your biology, the DNA in the cell and the nucleus, but it's the code after that that codes for proteins. So it's only one step further than most vaccines are in giving you the protein to have a response. This is the code which allows your body to make the proteins, and it rapidly degrades. So that's encouraging to know for pregnant moms, to know that it's not something that is going to stick around forever, that you're going to be sending across the placenta to your baby, and you can feel better about getting that vaccine and then getting it breastfeeding. Now, the other issue was infertility. I have had a lot of patients ask about internet rumors that this will cause infertility, and how do we know that it's not going to affect my ability to have children 10 years down the road? Well, part of the reason that came about was the mRNA code that we use. They saw some common parts of that code that were similar to the placental proteins, some of the placental proteins. But when they really continued to study this, it was not the whole code for a protein. So you don't see an antibody response to placental proteins like you do to the spike protein of the virus. And that was a concern, because we thought, well, maybe we would cause an antibody response to the mom's placenta and cause miscarriages and infertility, but that has not been the case. And when you compare that to a whole year's worth of data with COVID infections, we haven't seen an increase in infertility, and that's borne out nationally and internationally. We don't see an increased infertility rate. So when you think about COVID in pregnancy and how bad it can be, it's going to be at risk to increase your ICU stays, your maternal morbidity such as pneumonias and intubation, more complications, more hypercoagulable, increased blood clot risk in mothers, more preterm birth. That's the known. I always talk about patients' fears. You know, it's with the vaccine, it's the fear of the unknown. But with the COVID infection, we have a lot more of fear of the known things that we've seen over the past year versus fear of the unknown and trusting this vaccine. So I think you have to look at the overall picture, comparing the known of COVID infections versus the unknown of a vaccine, and what we have seen in research so far.
Oh, well, thank you. That's great information. And one of the things that you brought up that I think is really interesting, and it goes to something Dr. Hayes said earlier as well. We look a lot at the clinical trials, and there's a lot of the people who tend to be hesitant about the vaccine talk about the timing of the trials. We're almost 5 months into a much larger trial, right? And so if 30,000 Americans or folks across the globe were involved in the initial trials, we now have 100 million Americans that have gotten at least one shot. And so, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any single side effect that has caused any major large number of poor outcomes, and we're 5 months in. And you said something that triggered that thought in my mind, and you said something as well. What you said is that 92% of those employees in the healthcare space at St. Dom's have now gotten the vaccine. Well, that wasn't necessarily true in December and January when it was first made available, right? And so a lot of people, and this is what we're seeing now, I think more and more of, Dr. Dobbs, a lot of folks passed initially and said, I want to kind of see what happens with my friend and my neighbor. And what happened was some of them got the vaccine, and then they got the second vaccine, and now we're seeing more and more data which suggests not only does the vaccine protect you from a bad viral outcome, it also, by and large, and of course the data is not complete yet, but you can't really transmit the virus either, most likely. And Dr. Fauci said that over the weekend, but as we get further and further along, what we want is more and more Mississippians to get more and more comfortable with where we find ourselves.
That's a really good point. So when we do trials, it's a small, we have to have them powered enough. We have to have enough people, enough patients to show that either the whatever treatment plan works or doesn't work. And so that's a limited number of patients. But once it's put out into the general public, that's with any medicine or device, most of these things have a registry that goes along with it. So, for example, stent trials, okay, there was a small, says, hey, this was a good idea. Stents were put out into the market. We started giving patients with stents. This has been years ago, but we had registries to go along with it in case something came out that we didn't realize. Well, now we have basically 4 registries that are going along with these vaccines, and we haven't seen this big problem with them. And this is now, as you say, 5 months going into it, and the expected rate of having a problem, the actual rate is much less of a problem than the expected rate, which is encouraging to all of us. And the other point that I wanted to make, people worry about symptoms. I get the question of, well, how am I going to feel? I've heard, my Aunt Bessie had problems with the vaccine. Yes, some people will have, a fever or aches or what have you. That's to be expected. About 1 out of every 4 people that get the vaccine they don't feel right, they don't feel well, but that's just for a few days. After that, they're okay. That's just their natural immune response, developing the immunity to overcome. If they get exposed to the to the virus, they'll be able to fight it off. So it's like turbulence. I think about my wife, she and I, we don't like to fly. But when the pilot says, look, it's going to be a little bumpy for the next few minutes, fasten your seatbelt, we're going to be okay, and we get on to our destination. Yes, you may have a little turbulence when you get the vaccine, but it's going to be okay. You're still going to get to your destination, of safety. And that's what we're all about, is safety.
Yeah, and I think most people know that when I received my second vaccine, I had about 18 hours of turbulence, but it wasn't bad. It was, flu-like symptoms, a little bit of a fever, didn't feel great, but I was able to continue and move on and work, and I feel much better every morning waking up knowing that I have been vaccinated and that I do have at least a pretty strong level of protection.
Can I speak to that?
Oh, absolutely, please do.
One of the side effects, of course, being fever. That's always a concern in pregnancy is how do we handle fever? Could that increase your miscarriage rate if you have a fever in the first trimester? And that actually has been borne out to be less the case, less of a concern of increasing your risk of miscarriage. But we would encourage pregnant ladies who do get the vaccine that they can take Tylenol to help with their fever control if they develop a low-grade fever during the vaccine period.
I have one more question for Dr. Dobbs, because Melody sent it to me, and she said that her 7-year-old wants to know, when can he get the vaccine? Now, I know there's been some additional trials going on with kids and some of the various vaccines, so you want to just kind of talk through where we find ourselves there?
Yeah, it may not be very long. I mean, there are some studies on the Pfizer vaccine that have been released. I know Pfizer has submitted some information to FDA for review for 12 and older, and I would think younger age groups will be shortly thereafter. That looks like it's like 100% effective for kids, which is absolutely phenomenal. So I don't think it'll be too long. I'm hoping that going through the summer, we will have vaccine available for all age groups, and it may well be within the next few weeks we can have it for kids older than 12. which will be just so important to keep our schools open. And I think Mississippi's done a good job trying to educate our kids. I also would like to just add on and thank Dr. Travelstead for speaking to those concerns, because I've heard a lot of them too. And, go online to the American College of OBGYNs. They have a lot of great information and where they feel very comfortable with the vaccine, and that there's no risk of, no identified risk of any infertility issues and all that. And then one of the things we were talking about earlier is, under every circumstance, the vaccine is better than COVID. I mean, under every circumstance. And one of the people who worked for me had a bad case of COVID, and she got the vaccine and felt a little crummy, and she said, I'd do it 10 times over to not have COVID again, and then some more, because COVID can be so bad. And then, and the other thing, the question I got is, someone asked me before, is like, so if you're young and healthy, why do I get the vaccine? And I said, well, that's a good question. Obviously some young folks die. It's not that common, but it happens. We've seen a lot of younger folks across the country even now end up on a ventilator, and not that they're going to die, but 2 weeks on a ventilator is no walk in the park. But we have other things. It's so you don't sick, miss work, you don't have to quarantine, you don't have to your family doesn't get it, your family doesn't have to quarantine. But also long COVID, I think, is a real thing. And if we look at a majority of people have some symptom left over 6 months after COVID, if you just think about that. And if you can avoid all that with a vaccine, and a majority of people don't have a reaction to the vaccine, it seems to be very well worth it.
Certainly think so. Again, this has been hopefully a helpful conversation. I know we've got a lot of folks from the press that are also getting a lot of questions as well, and I know there are probably a lot of questions out there, but I do want to encourage everyone. I'm going to answer a question if you ask it, but if we can stick as close to vaccine efficacy and hesitancy, et cetera, as we can, at least initially, and because I really want us to continue to see increases in demand for the vaccine, because I believe it to be safe, and I think it's very helpful to society as a whole when people step up and make the decision to get the vaccine, because no question, the higher percentage of the population that is vaccinated, the lower the percentage and the lower the likelihood that COVID numbers are going to spike back up. And that is an issue that we have been fighting off and on really for the entirety of the last year and a half, and we want to continue to see numbers stay at these levels or below, which quite frankly are incredibly low and date back to last year in April and May numbers, honestly. So with that, questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Governor. I'd like to ask you something first, Dr. Dobbs, if I may. This kind of centers around hospitalizations, but vaccines would tie into it because that would avoid this. Over Easter weekend, I was looking on the MSDH website. ICU bed availability is in the single digits for almost every hospital in the Jackson Metro. UMMC was in the negatives. I assume that means they're over capacity. So with hospitalizations declining, can you explain why we would be in this situation, and would this mean that we are at risk of putting a new burden on our healthcare workers if a fourth wave were to come after Easter because of the low availability, it looks like?
Across the state, our bed availability does continue to increase. So if we look at the trends, the pressure from COVID is very minimal right now. The question of ICU beds in the Jackson area is a perpetual challenge. They're often, and Dr. Hayes, no. I mean, they're pretty tight all the time, yeah. And there's a lot of shuffling, a lot of bedding in the ER until you can get a room open and that sort of thing. And actually, I don't know if Dr. Hayes, if you want to say something.
Yeah. So even pre-COVID, we always had struggle. Hospitals going in diversion. Fortunately, the hospitals and the physicians all in this area get along, and so we shift, we flex to where the patient need. We can help the patients, and so we're just getting back to the norm. And so that was happening before COVID, and so COVID just put more pressure on the system, and we had to become creative, and that's why we developed a system of care to where we could shift all around. So that's not an unusual problem for us.
But looking at the single-digit availability right now, would you say we are at risk for a new burden to come if people weren't careful over Easter weekend, whether it's more non-COVID patients taking up space or not?
It's always a challenge, that's right. And so we have to be innovative, in which we are, and so we'll meet the challenge. Yeah.
Scott.
Are you frustrated with these calls from Washington to put these new restrictions in based on a blanket approach as opposed to a per state basis? Dr. Reeves? I'm just trying to know.
You know, Scott, I try not to get frustrated in this job. If I allowed myself to get frustrated, I would be in an eternal state of frustration, particularly with Washington, D.C. Look, the reality is, and it's a real philosophical difference in the current and the previous administration, and it's a real philosophical difference in the Biden administration and the way I think. I believe that governors are much better positioned to make decisions for their state than anybody in Washington, D.C. will ever be able to make decisions for our state. The fact is, the Biden administration believes, they truly believe in a central decision-making authority, and they believe that decision-making authority should be in Washington, and so they believe more in a one-size-fits-all approach. There is no doubt that if you look at the number of cases in New York City and in New Jersey and the number of cases in Michigan, they are in a spot right now that is very, very different than where we are. And that's just a fact. And what that means is I wish that this administration would trust those governors to make the decisions that were best for their constituents and let those of us here make the decisions that are best for our state. And that's what we're ultimately going to do. This president or the previous president didn't really have legal authority to force upon us certain things, and that's still the case. And so we're going to continue to do what we think is best based upon our data. There are those in Washington who want to talk about the data and the science when the numbers are going up, and they want us to ignore the data and the science when the numbers are going down, but we're just not going to do that. We're going to continue to do what's best for our constituents, but I will say, because of where our numbers are now, because we have come down so considerably, it really gives us even more of an opportunity to encourage more and more of our citizens to get the vaccine so that we can keep it at these levels. There's no doubt that there's certainly suggestions made by CDC and others that you shouldn't get the vaccine within 90 days of having had the virus. I'm not an expert on that. Anybody can speak to it if they want to. But right now, there are a lot of people in Mississippi that have not had the virus in the last 90 days. So we have a real opportunity to get vaccinated, and we want to encourage people to do it. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Governor. It was kind of touched up on earlier, but I'd like to get more of a response from you. Pfizer is in the process of working on a type of the vaccine that would work for kids 12 to 15. Whatever the time frame is, how quickly would you act and trust that the vaccine can be approved for Mississippians, and how quickly would you make that available?
Well, I think we'll work with Dr. Dobbs and his team, and if and when the approval process occurs, we'll certainly make it available for those individuals who want it as quickly as we need to. Again, if you are above the age of 16 and you are eligible for a shot, you can get a shot in Mississippi today. And if the FDA and the other proper authorities lower that age, and we look at the data and we agree with it, which I feel certain we will, then we'll open it up, the eligibility for whoever is approved for the vaccine.
You still ballparking maybe a couple of weeks down the road before we lower from 16 to 12 range?
I'll let Dr. Dobbs speak to that. I think it's more than that, but
It's hard to say. I mean, I know that they've submitted data to FDA. I haven't seen a timeline on it yet, so I mean, I think it'll be before the summer. Yeah, but it might only be a few weeks. We'll see.
Bailey, questions?
Hello, hi. So I noticed on the website that there are tens of thousands of open appointments right now. And anecdotally, I've heard that there are lines for the J&J vaccine, but slack demand for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. Do you think it's possible that the state has reached most of those who are enthusiastic about getting the vaccines? And are we seeing the impact of vaccine hesitancy right now? I mean, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I do think that there is a higher demand right now for the J&J vaccine than there is that for the other two. But the primary reason for that is the other two we have had in existence and have been putting shots in arms since December for both Pfizer and Moderna. And so the feature, and I didn't know exactly how this was going to play out, but the feature of a one-shot dose of the J&J, and keep in mind, we are basically in the first week of massive distribution of Johnson & Johnson in our state, and I presume that's true across the country. But there was a fairly large amount, and months really, of pent-up demand for the one-shot solution. And so I do think that there is no doubt that coming onto the marketplace has caused those individuals that have been waiting for that one-shot solution to jump out there and get it. In terms of have we reached the point at which we have vaccinated all the people who are excited about it, I think we're at that point. I think we've probably vaccinated in Mississippi everyone who was willing to drive a couple hundred miles to get it. When we first came out with the vaccines, we set up about 21 or 22 mass vaccination sites all around our state. And what you found was there were people that were willing for the first really for December, January, February, March, there were people willing to drive a couple hundred miles not knowing how long they'd have to wait in line just if they could get that first vaccination. That tended in large part to be those that were most vulnerable. Most of those individuals were over the age of 65. That's the reason in our state we're really close, I believe, to about 75% of all those individuals over the age of 65 have actually gotten a vaccine. We can verify between 65 and 70, and then we have a fairly decent-sized population where we don't have all of that data. But we're close to 75% of our population over the age of 65 have gotten the vaccine. And so as I look back on it, I think one of the good decisions that we've made, because I think it's going to be really important going forward, one of the good decisions that we've made is through our health department, we joined with literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of community partners. And even though we could have perhaps been more efficient early on by putting more vaccines in our drive-through sites, we continued to work with our partners and send them vaccines. And the reason that was so important is because we knew when we got to where we are now, simplicity was going to be as important as anything else in terms of getting that next 10% of the population to get vaccines. In other words, where we're seeing some of our biggest numbers is in, say, our local pharmacies, in our local physicians' offices. People may be going there for some other reason and them looking up and saying, oh, my doctor said he had a vaccine, or he or she had a vaccine available for me. Should I maybe just go ahead and get it? And the answer is yes, and so that's often happened. And so we knew that we needed that distribution network, and we are still seeing large numbers of vaccinations on a daily basis, even though we do have appointments available really throughout the state at our mass vax sites that are available. Dr. Dobbs, do you want to touch on that at all? Or?
Yeah, and I think that's the key is the degree of enthusiasm, right? But even though, you know, the rabid sort of person to get it who's really super anxious, we still did 130,000 shots last week. So we're still doing sort of like our same sort of pinnacle shot. So it's really that just folks aren't willing to get an appointment 3 weeks from now. Mm-hmm. You know, our appointments go out weeks ahead. And so that's really where most of the available appointments are. It's going to be down the road. The other piece about that is it's different in different areas. If we look at the Jackson metro area, DeSoto, and some other places, there's still robust demand, and the drive-through clinics are going very, very quickly. One of the challenges, and we brought this up with our federal partners, is we do the Pfizer product primarily through our drive-throughs, in part because the minimum order is 1,170, and small clinics can't take over 1,000 doses. And so we're just desperately begging the federal government to find a way to break those up into smaller lots so that we can share with small communities. And ideally, we'd have single-dose pre-filled syringes, just like you do with flu. So you go into your doctor's office, You get a shot, and they're not having to waste anything left over in the bottle, because in Moderna now they're putting 15 shots in a bottle, and you've got to use it all within the course of several hours.
Yeah, and Dr. Dobbs and I actually spoke about this earlier today, and it has been a frustration. It's been a frustration of governors across the country, I think Republican and Democrat alike, that we have been urging the Biden administration to encourage these partners that are manufacturing the vaccines to ship them in smaller numbers, because while if you're in New York City and you're sending a package to one of the large pharmacies in downtown Manhattan, there are literally millions and millions of people within walking distance, most likely, of that particular pharmacy. Well, if you're in rural Itta Bena, Mississippi, that's just not the case. And so the rural areas across the country really need packaging that is a little bit less, so that we can utilize our small rural clinics, because we know that's where we need to make it as easy as possible for people to actually get the vaccine. That's a request that has fallen on deaf ears so far, but we're continually optimistic and hopeful that they will understand how important it is. Bailey?
Sarah Hazelhurst with the Clarion Ledger has a question.
Hi there. So based on federal level Mississippi state data, COVID-19 testing since February to now is down by about over half. I'm wondering why we aren't testing as much. And then with that, because we aren't testing, are total cases accurate based on the lack of testing, basically?
Can I answer this?
Yes.
We are testing less people because there are less sick people. And we've watched this very closely. There are numerous metrics. And Dr. Byers and I were looking at this very morning. We've been looking at testing trends. They track very closely the case rates, and people in Mississippi, by and large, get tested when they're sick or when their family member is sick. And when people aren't sick or the family members aren't sick, that they're much less likely to get tested. I encourage you to look at our COVID-like illness rate on our website, which is our syndromic surveillance mechanism that we do throughout the state to see people who have COVID-like illness. And it has reliably predicted the number of COVID cases, and it continues to decline. So it's important not to look at one data point or to, it's really easy. I mean, we've seen a lot of supposition about this means this, but we feel very confident that it's a true reflection of the case burden based upon all available data sources.
I remember those first several tests and how, and a lot of other Mississippians do as well. They're just not, no one's going to run out to get a test if they're just feeling peachy. That's just not going to happen. And so, and it really has if you look at the charts, COVID-like illness, total number of COVID cases and testing, they all look, there may be a lag time, obviously, but they all look very, very similar, really dating all the way back to March of last year. I mean, we had a little bit of surge in testing early on because people were really nervous and scared, but in the last 9 months, testing and the number of people that are tested, and by the way, we do not have fewer options for people to get tested, but we actually have more. People just aren't going to get tested unless they don't feel well, or someone that they've been exposed to doesn't feel well. I think that's probably.
Hunter Dawkins with the Gazebo Gazette has a question.
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you, Governor. 2 questions. Governor, the first question for you would be the Medicaid expansion initiative was approved recently to be on the ballot in 2022. And I just wanted to know of your opinion about that procedure and if you're in favor, if you're still against that alternative, that initiative also. And Dr. Dobbs, I wanted to raise a question with you about where we stand on the Initiative 42 program, if it's being set forward.
Thanks, Hunter, for those questions. It will not surprise you to know that I have not changed my position. I still oppose Obamacare expansion in Mississippi. But I just want to clarify one thing that you did say, because I think it's important. There was actually there was a initiative filed to get the approval such that they can then go out and try to get the 130,000 signatures that it takes to put it on the ballot. And so that's a long way from actually even getting on the ballot, much less approved. But there was a group that filed that before the Secretary of State's office, and so we'll see what comes of that. Dr. Dobbs on.
And I think you mean Initiative 65? Yeah, okay. 42 is education, right? Okay, yes, sir. Yeah, so we're working on it. We've had a series of meetings. We're going to have an advisory committee meeting tomorrow with our external advisors. We've been having weekly board meetings to go over the different components of the regulatory framework. We have submitted to the Secretary of State's office for review one section that deals with independent laboratories. We set that one up first because we know that's a bottleneck and it takes the longest to get settled. And so if businesses want to get into that, they will know the rules of the game so they can get in and provide that service. We still have the intent of meeting our constitutional deadlines and doing it in a way that maximally protects Mississippians from a safety perspective in the product, but also safe for children, pregnant women, vulnerable groups. There's a lot of work to do, but we'll keep working hard.
Thank you.
And CJ Lavaster has a question.
Thank you. Hey, Governor. Hey, Dr. Dobbs. Dr. Dobbs said 2 weeks ago, Governor, that Mississippi was one of the first states to reach vaccine parity for African Americans receiving COVID vaccinations, meaning the percentage essentially reflected the state's demographics. But this weekend to the national press, and even in this press briefing, you said you're still seeing hesitancy among rural Mississippians and African Americans. Are your comments concerning Black Mississippians up to date? Because they don't seem to match the data from your health department.
Yeah, so Mississippi has done a phenomenal job at ensuring access to the vaccine to all segments of our population. And I think the various groups that have been involved in that and engaged in that, and the various individuals should be exceptionally pleased with how that's occurred. And so what I said over the weekend to the national press was that early on we saw significant vaccine hesitancy amongst both rural whites and African Americans. And so if you look at it, CJ, and you actually look at the math, if you have reached parity with the population, and that parity that you have reached with the population comes with it a certain number of rural whites that are vaccine hesitant, then by definition you still have some vaccine hesitancy within the African American community as well. So what I would tell you is we have vaccine hesitancy by individuals in all groups across Mississippi, and that's just a fact. And it's true across America as well, because while we certainly have done a very good job of making the vaccine available to African Americans and to others, we find ourselves in a position now where we've got to continue to encourage more and more and more of our citizens to get the vaccine. And so I don't think my data is dated. I do think that we've got to continue to work every single day to convince Mississippians of all backgrounds, of all geographic areas, to get out and get this vaccine. Any other questions? We have been here exactly 1 hour, and so I want to thank everybody for joining us. I really do appreciate particularly our docs for being here. They've certainly provided a unique perspective, and I hope it's helped encourage more Mississippians to get the vaccine. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you so much for coming.